This is the third and final part of our lecture on pulmonary ventilation, and the focus is on oxygen transport in the blood, and we will revisit the famous Fick equation. As you know, most oxygen is carried in the blood bound to hemoglobin. Only a very small amount of oxygen is dissolved in the blood. So practically speaking, there is only one way to carry oxygen in the blood, and that's bound to hemoglobin. And what if we don't carry as much oxygen as we might need? We'll have to slow down. Just consider for a second carbon dioxide. What happens if we can't carry the carbon dioxide away from the body that we need? We become acidotic and we die. How can we carry carbon dioxide? Think of the buffering equation. You see carbon dioxide free, dissolved in the blood. You see it in the form of carbonic acid, and you see it in the form of bicarbonate. And some carbon dioxide is also carried with hemoglobin, not the same way oxygen is, but carried by the hemoglobin. So we've got redundant ways to transport carbon dioxide, only one way to transport the oxygen, bound to hemoglobin. We often talk about the oxygen carrying capacity. This is how much oxygen can be carried in the blood. Since 4 oxygen molecules can be carried on each molecule of hemoglobin, the oxygen carrying capacity depends upon the hemoglobin concentration. The first number in this next bullet, 1.34 milliliters per gram, is how much oxygen, 1.34 milliliters of oxygen, can be carried on each gram of hemoglobin. And I've multiplied that by a typical, for a 70 kilogram male, a typical hemoglobin concentration, 150 grams of hemoglobin per liter. This would be 15.0 grams per deciliter if you were at the doctor's office, to give you 200 milliliters of oxygen in each liter of blood. Compare that up to how much is dissolved, 200 bound to hemoglobin. Okay, it's all carried on the hemoglobin. So what becomes important for us are the determinants of hemoglobin concentration. What determines how much hemoglobin we have? What affects how much hemoglobin we have? This will affect how much oxygen we can carry in the blood. Well, here are 3 factors. The first, women tend to have, on average, 10% less hemoglobin than men. Now, if you look at the line below, the Fick equation, the content of oxygen in the arterial blood, that means this is reduced 10% in women, on average. The second factor is a disease like anemia. Now, this is kind of a circular definition because by definition anemia is a reduced hemoglobin concentration, and it doesn't matter whether it's dietary in nature, lack of vitamins, inability to absorb iron, lack of iron. If you have anemia, you have a reduced hemoglobin concentration and a reduced oxygen carrying capacity. That will affect your VO2 max. Now the third, training status. At first you might say, well, if I train every day, I go out and run every day, my muscles say I need more oxygen, so I'm going to build more hemoglobin. Well, you'd be correct. But if you then said, so my hemoglobin concentration will go up, not so fast. Every day you go out and run and your muscles say, we need more hemoglobin, we need more oxygen. Every day you go out and run, your body says, we need more blood to pump. Okay, look in the lower right-hand corner. The short column is your blood before training. So you can see you've got the hemoglobin in the red and the total blood volume in that open rectangle. All right, after training on the right, you can see, yes, I have more hemoglobin. I was right. But you also see I have more plasma. So my total blood volume has increased, and if you look at it now, hemoglobin makes up a smaller percentage of the blood. So the hemoglobin concentration will actually go down with training. Now you say, how can that be a good thing? Look at the Fick equation. Reduced hemoglobin concentration negatively affects CaO2. All right, that's not a good thing. But the increased plasma volume and consequently the increased blood volume means greater cardiac output. And if you remember back, in a trained person, maximal cardiac output, 35 liters per minute compared to 25 liters per minute. Huge improvement, 40%, thanks to this, in part, to this increased blood volume. So the trade-off is worth it. I can pump a whole lot more blood, even if each liter of it carries a little less oxygen. I'm going to tell you a story. I have O-negative blood, the universal donor. Many years ago when I was training, I got a call would I go to the blood bank and give blood. So I got on my bike and I rode to the blood bank, and they took a drop of my blood and they put it in copper sulfate, which is a blue liquid. And the idea is if you got real thick, strong, lots of hemoglobin blood, it'll rocket to the bottom of this little tube. Well, mine just slowly worked its way to the bottom, and the technician looked at me and said, well, you're anemic. Well, I was a master student at the time, so I knew everything, and I said, well, being a highly trained endurance athlete, you would expect for me to be slightly anemic. And he said, if I really thought you were highly trained, I'd expect you to have a higher hemoglobin concentration. Well, who was right? Me. So what happened? He sent me home. A week later, I get a call. Can you come in and donate blood? Yeah, I said, yeah, sure. And they said, well, be sure to drink plenty of fluids. I said, okay. So I went out for a hard 10-mile run, and I came back and I didn't drink anything. Got up the next morning, went for a hard 10-mile run, didn't drink anything. Got on my bike, drove over to the blood donation place. They took a drop of my blood. And here I am, of course, severely dehydrated. And my drop of blood is very thick because I have removed a lot of plasma, so I'm passively hemoconcentrating. So that little drop of blood drops rapidly to the bottom of the tube, and they say that's very good. They take half a liter of my blood. They give me a cookie and one of those mini micro bottles of juice to replenish my fluids, and they say you probably should have someone drive you home, and I say okay, and I go outside and get on my bicycle where I've hidden it in the bushes and wobble home through the Gainesville heat. Moral of the story, athletic anemia. It exists. If anything, highly trained athletes are actually going to look anemic. But in and of itself, that's not good. But the trade-off, how they got there by increasing their blood volume and consequently their maximal cardiac output, it's a good trade-off. The previous slide focused on hemoglobin concentration, which determines how much oxygen can be carried by the blood. On this slide, we're going to look at the factors that determine how much oxygen is carried by the blood at any particular time. The main factor is the partial pressure of oxygen in the plasma, in the blood. That will determine if the hemoglobin is, in fact, loaded up with as much oxygen as it can carry. Hemoglobin is loaded up 100% or 100% saturated if the partial pressure is 100 millimeters of mercury. So blood leaving the lung, if the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood is 100 millimeters of mercury, it will be fully loaded up. Given that the arterial partial pressure equals the alveolar partial pressure, and the alveolar partial pressure is 100 millimeters of mercury if ventilation is adequate, then blood leaving the lung will be 100% saturated with oxygen. And this question keeps coming up, does ventilation limit performance or VO2 max? Well, apparently not. with adequate ventilation, our blood is going to be loaded up 100% with oxygen. You can't blame ventilation for VO2 or VO2 max not being any higher. So that's the main factor, partial pressure of oxygen. There are some secondary factors which we will talk about in detail, allosteric effect of binding and the Bohr effect, which occurs under conditions when the pH drops, the pCO2 increases, the temperature increases, and the concentration of 2,3-DPG increases. So let's look at these factors. But before we do, I said if ventilation is adequate, ventilation is not the problem. Well, pulmonary capillary transit time is how long the blood has in the lung to pick up oxygen. It takes about 75/100ths, 3/4 of a second for the blood to go through the lung when your heart rate is around 70, so at rest. In heavy exercise or severe, if your heart rate is 200 beats per minute, then each beat occurs every third of a second, so your blood has about 3/10 of a second to pick up all that oxygen. How long does it take to pick up oxygen? 3 or 4/10 of a second. So you can see that in heavy or severe or extreme exercise, there is this possibility that the oxygen will not be able to fill up the hemoglobin. So we call this arterial desaturation. It is likely to occur only in highly trained endurance athletes, athletes who are pumping huge quantities of blood through their lung because of their greater cardiac output. Now you may say, well, wait, if they're highly trained endurance athletes, why won't their lungs work better? And the answer is the heart can pump a whole lot more blood because it's a muscle. It responds to training. The skeletal muscle can use more oxygen because they're muscles. They respond to training. The lung, the functional part of a lung, is a membrane between the alveoli and the capillaries. It's a membrane. You can't make a membrane work better. So although athletes can breathe in more air, they can't speed the process of diffusing oxygen into the blood. So they've got great lungs, but greater demands of the muscles. Something's got to limit performance. So in untrained people, it tends to be the muscles, can't use oxygen. In the highly trained endurance athletes, and of course, people with pulmonary disease, ventilation can in fact limit performance. Now we're looking at what determines how much oxygen actually is carried in the blood, or how much oxygen actually is carried by the hemoglobin. And we're expressing this amount of oxygen 3 ways on the y-axis. One, in red, is to say how many oxygens are bound to each hemoglobin. And the maximum amount is 4, so on average all the hemoglobins can have 4 oxygens each, or 3, or 2, or 1, or none. Another way to look at it is what is the percent saturation. So of all the possible oxygens that could be carried on the hemoglobin, what percentage actually are? So if every hemoglobin has 4 oxygens, the hemoglobin is 100% saturated. And finally, and you shall see these numbers in white are handy when we're talking the Fick equation, we can look exactly how much oxygen is that? How much are you talking about? It's all well and good to say 100% saturated. How much oxygen is that? Well, typical male hemoglobin concentration of 150. This is 200 milliliters of oxygen per liter of blood. So that's what you're looking at on the y-axis. On the x-axis, partial pressure of oxygen. If partial pressure of oxygen were the only factor determining percent saturation. This would be a straight line. But because of the allosteric effect of binding, you have this S-shaped curve. Now let's talk about why, thank goodness, we have this S-shaped curve. What does it mean? All right, look at the partial pressures on the x-axis. You should remember that we see a partial pressure of 100 when blood is in the lung, and we see a partial pressure of 40 when blood is entering the lung. So venous blood might have a partial pressure of 40, and matching up with the alveolar partial pressure, blood leaving the lung will have a partial pressure of 100. What if something was wrong in the lung, or you were at a modest altitude and the partial pressure in the alveoli, and consequently the partial pressure in the arteries, wasn't 100, but it was 10 millimeters of mercury less? How would that affect the percent saturation? Well, at 100 millimeters of mercury, you're 100% saturated. At 90 millimeters of mercury, that second dashed line, you are 100% saturated. No effect. So because this relationship is flat across the top, it means that a small change in partial pressure in the lung does not reduce the amount of oxygen that can be carried by the blood. Now you see a steep part of the curve associated with partial pressures that we might see in venous blood, in blood leaving the muscle, or in the muscle. What you have there is, if the partial pressure is 10 millimeters of mercury less, so if we're talking in the muscle and the mitochondria are using up that oxygen fast, so the partial pressure is less, then the amount of oxygen that can be carried by the hemoglobin is reduced dramatically. So what you need to see here are, under normal conditions, partial pressure, 100 millimeters of mercury in blood leaving the lung. That's that dashed line to the far right. Blood is 100% saturated. If you look at the second dashed line from the left, partial pressure is 40 millimeters of mercury. That's the typical partial pressure in the body, in the muscles. Hemoglobin is 75% saturated. So it drops off the difference between those two horizontal lines. It drops off 50 milliliters of oxygen per liter of blood. So the difference between that top dashed horizontal line and the second dashed horizontal line is the AVO2 difference at rest. If we've got lots of muscle activity and the partial pressure in the muscles and the body in general isn't 40 but it's 30, then the AVO2 difference is 200 milliliters of oxygen per liter minus 100. So the difference between what's carried away from the heart and lung and what's carried back is the AVO2 difference. Now, why do we have this S-shaped curve? I hope you can see that it's wonderful that we do. Why do we have it? Well, to explain it, we use the postage stamp analogy, and those little green squares are supposed to be postage stamps. And if you want to tear off the first postage stamp, and notice, by the way, 4 stamps, 4 oxygens bound to each hemoglobin. If you want to remove the first stamp, you have to tear to get it removed. You want to get the next one off, tear, next one off, tear, the last one pretty near falls off. Okay, now look at oxygens bound to hemoglobin. You want to get the first one off, you have to tear. You have to drop the partial pressure from 100 millimeters of mercury down to 40. You want to get the next one off? Drop the partial pressure from 40 to 30. Next one off, 30 to 20. Last one almost falls off. So the postage stamp analogy tries to explain the allosteric effect. And the allosteric effect is that hemoglobin holds on to oxygen, or the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen, is determined by the number of oxygens attached. So when it has 4 oxygens, it holds on really tight, really hard, and you have to drop the partial pressure an awful lot for it to release the first of the oxygens. And this is a very good thing because it means that under most normal or near normal conditions, hemoglobin is going to be 100% saturated when it leaves the lung. So that's the allosteric effect. Next is the Bohr effect, which I said occurs when temperature is high, levels of carbon dioxide are high, pH is low, meaning there's lots of acidity. When might these things occur? In severe exercise, And don't worry about 2,3-DPG. It just reflects how hard, if you will, how hard the red cells are working. The Bohr effect, we say, shifts the curve to the right. Okay, nothing really moves. It simply means when the temperature is high, when the carbon dioxide is high, when the acidity is high, we have a different relationship, shown here in yellow. So what are the implications of having this different relationship, for all intents and purposes, during exercise? What is the effect in the lung? Well, before, without the Bohr effect, if the partial pressure was 100, percent saturation was 100. Now, with the yellow curve, if the partial pressure is 100, the percent saturation is, again 100. No effect on the percent saturation in the lung, meaning blood is 100% saturated with oxygen when it leaves the lung. This is good. Now let's look at a particular partial pressure that we might see in the exercising muscle. Pick 40 millimeters of mercury. So that's that dashed line that has all the arrows converging on it right smack dab in the middle of the picture. Under normal conditions, with the blue curve, when the partial pressure is 40, the blood would be 75% saturated. But when the Bohr effect is in effect, the blood is only 50% saturated. So instead of dropping off 1 oxygen from every hemoglobin, it drops off 2. So the way I like to look at this is not that the curve was shifted to the right, but that the curve was shifted down, at least in the tissues. So together, the allosteric effect and the Bohr effect ensure that we're loading the blood up 100% with oxygen in the lung, and also ensure that the needed oxygen is dropped off in the tissues. All right, we've just gone over a lot of physiology, and this is one of the hardest parts, and that's taking that S-shaped curve that we looked at and remembering back to the lectures on cardiac output and trying to put it all together to come up with some reasonable numbers for the Fick equation. And if you have to go back and look at the S-shaped curve a few times, that's fine. If you have to go back to the previous lecture and look at values for the PaO2, that's fine, and the PvO2. Of course, you were supposed to have memorized those values, right? And you may want to go back and to the cardiovascular lecture and make sure you remember the factors that stroke volume and heart rate that determine the cardiac output that we see here in the Fick equation. At rest, we pump 5 liters of blood. The oxygen carrying capacity there, or the content of oxygen in the arterial blood, 200 milliliters of oxygen per liter of blood, and assuming that the partial pressure of oxygen in the venous blood is 40 millimeters of mercury, then the hemoglobin is 75% saturated. It brings back 75 milliliters of oxygen in each liter of blood, so it drops off 50, and you can do the math and calculate the resting VO2. In exercise, cardiac output increases fivefold. Content of oxygen in the arterial blood, unchanged. Remember, ventilation is not a limiting factor, so we're still able to load up the blood 100% with oxygen. And again, this ties back lectures about ventilation and about that S-shaped curve. Blood returning to the heart, now the partial pressure is less than 40 millimeters of mercury, and the Bohr effect is influencing things. So blood coming back to the heart is only 25% saturated, is only carrying 50 milliliters of oxygen per liter. And again, you can do the math and calculate what VO2 max is for a typical untrained person. Now you might say, well, why does blood come back with any oxygen at all? Why is that 50? Why isn't it 0? And the answer is, blood coming from the muscles may have close to 0 oxygen in it. But as you exercise, even as you exercise, some blood may be going to the gut, some to the skin, some to the brain. So some blood is coming back with 150 milliliters of oxygen. Parts of the body that aren't specifically increasing their metabolic rate. So the average, as the blood returns to the heart and the lung, is this 50 milliliters. And then that next line shows you VO2 max for a trained individual. So cardiac output has increased, maximal cardiac output has increased to 35 liters per minute. And I'm showing 200 mLs of oxygen per liter. So that's assuming there's no athletic anemia. And it's just easier for us to look at it this way when we have the numbers. And the content of oxygen in the venous blood is ever so slightly lower. So we have increased the AVO2 difference, the maximal AVO2 difference, a little bit by training, mostly because we get better at sending the cardiac output to the muscles. And of course, the muscles are able to extract and use more oxygen. And it really goes the other way around. The muscles are able to use more oxygen, so they create a greater gradient, which sucks the oxygen out of the blood. So altogether, you can see how exercise affects cardiac output and pulmonary function, oxygen carrying capacity, and actual amount of oxygen in the blood, and how these are affected after training. Okay, we've just looked at a lot of things in these 3 lectures. The relationship between minute ventilation, respiratory rate, and tidal volume. Factors that, if they happen, will cause you to breathe more. And then we discussed what actually does happen in exercise to make us breathe more. We talked about the importance of the partial pressure of oxygen and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. And then in this most recent lecture, we talked about oxygen carrying capacity. And then we tried to put it all together, looking at the Fick equation. And along the way, of course, we have talked about the bicarbonate buffer system. So a lot of information, and I really think you're probably going to want to go back and review parts of these over and over again to make sure you got it all down pat. A lot of information. Enjoy, and remember, it's a thing of beauty.